Good morning. I'm very happy and honored to be introducing Father Clooney from the Harvard Divinity School as our speaker this morning. Father Clooney joined the Harvard Divinity School faculty in 2005, where he is the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology. After earning his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations, he taught at Boston College for 21 years before coming to Harvard. From 2010 to 2017, he was the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. His primary areas of scholarship are comparative theology and the theological and commentarial writings of the Sanskrit and Tamil traditions of Hindu India. And Father Clooney has been instrumental in bringing Hindu monastics like myself to the Harvard Divinity School. So please join me in welcoming Father Clooney.
Good morning. Happy to be with you today. I came here first, I think, some 30 years ago. We Jesuits used to have the property right below here. You may recall, some of you, the seminary property, and I made a long retreat, 30 days of retreat, back in 1991. And one of the treats of the break days was to come up here and see Vrajaprana and talk to the other nuns and visit the wonderful bookstore. So I'm always happy. I've come back maybe once or twice since then, but it's always lovely to come back. So I'm happy and grateful to Vrajaprana for the invitation. I'm sorry she's a bit sick, and so she's not actually here in the room at present. But to Krishna Prana, also, who's a gracious host of my event, and Durga, who is a wonderful presence at Harvard Divinity School this year. Gracious presence, learning, I think, from our faculty and our students, and bringing so much wisdom to us as well. And then my guide and charioteer today was Swami Maidananda from Hollywood, an old friend, a scholar himself, who drove me up here today, assuring me that we would not be running into smoke and fire on the way. So it's a tragic situation, but we came safely through without any problems. So I'm happy to be here with you today and to talk about my book, Hindu and Catholic Priest and Scholar, A Love Story, which is a book I published last year. It came out about 6 months ago. And it's kind of a memoir talking about my life's journey as a Catholic priest who, for some 50 years more has been studying Hinduism in various ways, and kind of telling the story of how, as a Catholic priest, I can, on the one hand, be a Catholic priest, continue to be a Catholic priest, a member of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and also be learning from Hinduism all these years. I was told to promote the book that the bookstore will be taking the names of people who would like to order copies through the bookstore. You can also get it directly from Bloomsbury or on Amazon and so on if you want it. But maybe after I finish speaking, you'll realize you don't want it, and then that'll solve the problem. But the book will be available, and the bookstore will be taking names so that Vrajaprana will know how many copies to order of the book. So the basic thing to start with is that, if you haven't noticed, I'm getting older. I'm 74. I'll be 75 in August of this year. And it's a point of life when you reach a certain age, when you begin to think about, well, what does it all add up to? What is the life for? When you look back on your life, not so much to say, was it up or down in general, but the pluses and minuses, the things that happened along the way that you might regret, things that you're incredibly grateful for, and thinking over the past few years that it might be good to tell my story. And so it's a bit of an unusual story. I mean, if you read the book, you'll see there's nothing terribly dramatic. There are no murder mysteries or anything in the book. Kind of a serene life in a certain way. But it's a kind of story of interreligious learning as a way of life. And to be able to do this from when I was young until this current point in my life, I was thinking about this, a few years ago, about telling the story that in terms of the work I do, as Durga mentioned, the general field of comparative theology. So not theology only my own tradition, but what we call theology in Catholic tradition, faith-seeking understanding across religious borders. And so going to another tradition, learning in faith and bringing that back to enrich and challenge your own faith. To tell the story of how this came about as a personal discipline, but also as one that has a certain, larger value. The thing to start with perhaps would be that, thinking about this during years ago, and then during COVID, when we're all kind of more solitary and kind of cut off from so many things around us and the trauma of so many people dying of COVID and so on like that, again, kind of existentially, now is the time to put it together. And so during COVID, while teaching on Zoom for the most part, nonetheless trying to be able to write down the story and decide exactly what is the story. So I decided it would not be a long book. I know a number of scholars who've done their autobiographies of like 500 pages or 800 pages. I know one scholar, Peter Brown, a longtime professor at Princeton University, historian of like religious history. His autobiography is this big book about 700-800 pages, volume 1. And I think this will be the only volume of my memoir that I've kept to under 200 pages and tried to get at some essential points that I'd like to share with you today. If you've ever done this, either actually in writing or perhaps by just pondering when you're walking or sitting in a chair or in the summertime or when you're alone or with friends or family, looking back over your life and asking what it's all about, you have to sift through your memories back as far as you can remember, thinking about your childhood, your upbringing, college study if you went to college, travels, love relationships, and on and on. And it was very instructive for me to go back and think as far back as I could to early childhood memories. And to begin with the admission that my life is pretty standard in one way of growing up Irish Catholic in New York City. So I was born in 1950, and 1950s Catholicism was fairly standard, fairly predictable. Growing up in a Catholic family, my grandparents on my father's side came from Ireland, literally. They got on the boat and got off by the Statue of Liberty, came into New York City. On my mother's side, my mother's family way back was German family, and her father's side had come over after the potato famine back in the 1840s or so. So an Irish Catholic family, staunch Catholic, unable to imagine that one would be anything other than Catholic. I have my lovely parents, deceased now. I have my two sisters, Mary and Regina, still living in New York City. Growing up Catholic, went to Catholic school. In grammar school, the 8th grades, I have 7 religious sisters teaching me in 7 of the 8 years, which today would be somewhat unusual. But the sisters with their big habits and the veils, looking very uncomfortable, particularly in the hot weather. Wonderful teachers. I had no horror stories about the nuns. They were a great gift to me. They educated me, gave me the push to get started in life. I was an altar boy. I'm old enough that I learned the prayers of the altar boy in Latin before Vatican II, the great council of the church in the 60s. Learned all the prayers by the book, and the priest is there at the altar, and you have to make sure you do everything right. And then a year later, the pastor told us, okay, we can forget the Latin now. Vatican II said we could now do it in English, so let's switch to English. But I'm glad I had the experience. Then I went to a Catholic high school, Regis High School in Manhattan, New York, up on 84th Street near Park Avenue. Took the Staten Island ferry over to Manhattan, the number 4 train up to Regis High School every day. And again, it was a very Catholic place, very Catholic and Jesuit place, the Society of Jesus. And probably there were, in the school, which was only about 600 boys, it was about maybe 20 Jesuits among the faculty. So lots of priests in the classroom. And it was sort of taken for granted that that was the way things were. Nowadays, you'd be lucky if you found one Jesuit priest on the faculty of a school like Regis. So it was all a time of very Catholic, the tumult of the 60s, the changes coming, the protest of the Vietnam War, the flower children, time of experimentation, great longing and looking was happening. But nonetheless, for somebody like me, it was like the straight path of being a Catholic. And so when I was 17, felt called to become a seminarian, to become a Jesuit priest, entered the seminary just like 5-6 days after I turned 18, which now seems incredibly young. If I could go back and tell myself, you're too young, don't do it, it's at 18 years old. But it was common in those days that if you have a sense of vocation, God calling you, then why wait? God will call you when God wants you. And as the prophets of Israel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and others, you can't say, I'm not ready, I'm too young. God says, I just called you. The one thing you need is to be called, and you are ready. So I entered the seminary at age, just turned 18, St. Andrew on Hudson, Poughkeepsie, New York, just north of the city of Poughkeepsie, just below the Roosevelt Estate on the Hudson River, and began again a traditional Catholic training in a seminary. We were given cassocks to wear, black cassocks to wear. In the first week, the new novice master, who was somewhat of a radical, told us after the first week, okay, you don't have to wear them anymore, except on special occasions. But we learned a lot more Greek and Latin. The prayers were very much the prayers of the Mass. Everything was very Catholic. Then I went down to Fordham University in Manhattan and did my, in the Bronx, and did my BA training. And we were all philosophy majors, but my second major was classics, Greek and Latin, because I had done a lot of Greek and Latin in high school. So again, a very traditional training. And then I did theology studies in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at the Jesuit school. The Jesuit school has now moved somewhere else, but I still teach in Cambridge at Harvard, but did the traditional training to become a Catholic priest, was ordained a priest in 1978. So all of this, I stress all of this because it's not very extraordinary. Maybe today it would be unusual to have it so simple, but there was a way in which it was kind of this flowing Catholic identity. And that's part of what I try to communicate in the book, that unlike many young women and men in the 1960s and 70s, I was not a seeker. I was not even a radical. I was not kind of looking and trying to figure out what to do. And I didn't smoke hashish. I didn't do pot. I didn't do sex. I didn't go on journeys. I didn't spend years in India. I was sort of just being a Catholic was all I wanted. That was all for me. So part of the book is to say a Catholic. So the title of the book, Hindu and Catholic, the Catholic part is pretty staunch. And I grew up with that. And so now I'm a Jesuit, I think it's going on 57 years, and a Catholic priest 47 years. Still Catholic, still have a parish on the weekend, go and say the Mass and give the sermon and so on like that. All of that's kind of ordinary. But the second part was, the title of the book is not Catholic, but Hindu and Catholic. And the thing that I try to communicate also in the book is how the Hindu part got in there. And I use, Hindu, forgive me for using a kind of generic word, because we know that there are many different traditions of Hinduism, Vaishnava, Shaiva, Tantrika, the Vedanta tradition, and so on. But using it in a generic sense right now, how did it come in? And it came in this way, that when I was just about 20, 21, as a young seminarian still, we had a conference, I think it was in Syracuse at Lemoyne College, on the international apostolate or international identity of Jesuits. And the speakers emphasized to us again and again that when you become a Jesuit, you enter a worldwide society. The Jesuits were founded by St. Ignatius Loyola in 1540. And immediately, within a year of its founding, Francis Xavier, who became St. Francis Xavier, went off to India. And then he went to current-day Indonesia area, then he went to Japan, and he died still a young man when he was trying to go into China to meet the Emperor of China. And the society has always kind of had a global identity. The largest number of Jesuits in the world now are in India, 4,000 plus. This country maybe has 2,500 or something like that. So a global organization, but he was telling us kind of in a direct way, don't just be a New Yorker. Don't just be a Jesuit from California. Don't just be an Indian Jesuit, but you enter a global group. So me in my little head, 20, 21 years old, thinking to myself, well, if that's true, then should I do something different about my experience becoming a priest? And part of the training of the Jesuits was you do your BA philosophy study, then you do a break. You go out and do some active work for 2 or 3 years in a parish, let's say as a hospital chaplain, orderly work, whatever, teaching in a school, high school, whatever. And then you come back and do theology study, and then you get ordained. So what to do in those 2 or 3 years, given the fact that I had gone to a high school in Manhattan and was pretty good at the Greek and Latin, the obvious thing to do was to go back to Regis High School, or a few 20 blocks away, Xavier High School, or across the river to St. Peter's High School, or to Brooklyn Prep, et cetera, and teach Latin and Greek. And that would sort of become my preparation for my life. But the message of the conference was, do something universal, do something global. And so I began to think to myself, as a young Jesuit, and I had no real power over what would happen to me, where I would be sent, but I want to do something different. And so I began to look into possibilities and talk to the superiors about doing like this teaching experience or ministry period outside the United States, which others had done. I wasn't like going to be the first to do that. But for me, it was totally unexpected because I was just, again, this New York kid, born in Brooklyn, grew up on Staten Island, straight arrow, Latin and Greek, not very adventuresome. Going to Pennsylvania was an adventure. Going to Connecticut was an adventure. But I began to think, and Jesuits in New York had connections in the Philippines, could do that. The Caroline Marshall Islands in the Pacific could do that. I talked to a priest in Ecuador who had a program for street kids, and he very earnestly invited me to come learn Spanish and work with him. Puerto Rico, Nigeria. And these are all fascinating options that could have kind of filled my life and go on this road or this road or this road. But it was something in me deep down saying, well, none of that is quite what I'm looking for. And then suddenly, like a vision came up of India, came into my mind. And we had, New York Jesuits had no connection with India. There's no history there. But it somehow got into my mind and began to, like the seed growing within me of go to India. Now, I've had Hindu friends over the years said, well, that's obviously true because in your previous life you were a Hindu. So no-brainer coming back. My name is Francis Xavier Clooney. And I said the first Jesuit to leave Europe was Francis Xavier, who went to India. So they said, you have come back. You are here again. But I told myself, again, that then I hadn't even read the Bhagavad Gita, much less studied anything really, that I was attracted because one thing, I knew Latin and Greek. And somebody told me that Sanskrit was of the same language family as Latin and Greek. And I said, I can build on my Latin and Greek and learn another language. And that makes sense, although I was going to be teaching in a high school, not being a scholar. And then I gave as a reason, which was somewhat true, but also not the most convincing, I admired 2 people, Mother Teresa and Mahatma Gandhi. I wasn't going to be a Mother Teresa or a Mahatma Gandhi, but suddenly, if these people are in India, then this somehow makes sense for me to go to India too. Because I wanted some kind of a combination of being the scholarly person who knows Greek and Latin, who can read Sanskrit eventually, I hoped, and a person who is like among the poor. And so Mother Teresa with the poorest of the poor, and Gandhi fasting for the sake of the oppressed, the Dalits, working for the liberation of India from the British. I said, I want to be like these people. And somehow it just became clear that I was being drawn to India. I didn't go to India because of visa issues. 1971 was the Bangladesh war that liberated Bangladesh, East Pakistan from Pakistan. And the United States, which is often foolish in its foreign affairs, took the side of Pakistan. And India was not happy. Indira Gandhi said, enough, US, we don't want any more missionaries coming to India anyway. And so some old wise priest said, why don't you go to Kathmandu? And that was an eye-opening experience for me because I didn't know where Kathmandu was. It's in Nepal. I didn't know where Nepal was. And so I had to, in those days I couldn't go to Google and Google it. This was 72. I had to, go to the library and take out the atlas and look up the map and find Nepal, which is this little country, as you know, perched between India and Tibet in China. It's not actually a little country. The population now is maybe 30, 40 million, so it's sizable compared to many countries. But it seems tiny between the 2 largest population countries in the world. A beautifully, spectacularly beautiful country, particularly back then before pollution set in, with the valley of Kathmandu is about 5,000 feet up, and then above it the hills go to 10, 12,000 feet. And in the back, like in the clear season after the monsoon, the high Himalayas, the snow-capped mountains, and from the roof of our school, St. Xavier's School in Kathmandu, you could see Mount Everest. And so it was quite spectacular and beautiful. And I said, okay, I'll do that. And I didn't know what I was getting into. And when I explained to the superior who was like assigning us to, where do you do your high school or teaching work or whatever, again, Jersey City, Manhattan, Buffalo, whatever, I sort of said, I'd like to go to Kathmandu. And he didn't know where Kathmandu was either. But he knew me because he had been principal of the high school, Regis, when I was there. So he sort of knew I was not totally crazy. And he said, okay, go ahead and do it. And so, things had to be done. But I ended up in '73, after I graduated from Fordham, teaching in St. Xavier's School in Kathmandu. And it turned out, I knew this on paper, but being there, it's a boarding school set up 25 years before at the invitation of the King of Nepal, who invited the Jesuits up from India to set up a school because he wanted a good school where his son, the future King Mahendra, had gone to a Jesuit school in India. And King Tribhuvan said, we want a good school, obviously the Jesuits. So he called up the Jesuits in Patna in Bihar and said, Father, would you come up and set up a school? And they did. They went up and set up a school. He gave them palaces to use as the school properties and so on like that. And I get there in '73, and all the boys I taught, I was 22 when I got there, teenagers, and they were all Hindu and Buddhist. And I had no real background. I did like a book on Indian philosophy, a translation of the Gita or part of the Gita I read, but I wasn't really ready for this. And probably the best thing for me, who spent my life with my nose buried in books, was the fact that my existential introduction to Hinduism was dealing with teenage boys who are Hindu and Buddhists. No nonsense. You're a young Jesuit, so we'll torture you as much as possible in the classroom, give you a hard time. But they also, we bonded, and they sort of liked me, I think, and I liked them certainly. And we'd have holidays and all that. They'd take me. I remember one time in the night going out on Shivaratri over to the Pashupati temple, or going through the rice fields and trying not to fall off, going to the temple. I couldn't go in because it's a very sacred temple, but outside looking across from the other side of the river, looking down, and the boys would go in, come out with the kumkum, the tika on their foreheads, Navaratri in the fall, the great fall festival leading to Diwali, the Buddhist stupas, shrines, and so on. So it was very existential. And at one point I was teaching a course which was called Moral Science. And the deal with the king was, you can teach him anything you want, but don't proselytize. And so what was done was, instead of teaching Christian ethics, Christian theology, to teach like moral science, which is like generic principles, be good, avoid evil, tell the truth, don't steal, respect your neighbor. And I had this book to use in class. And again, these kids are 15, 16 years old. And we found, me and them both, as I began to use this book, that it was very sound and very thoughtful and really, really boring. These abstract principles about being good and bad. So I began to ponder in our library and found again the Bhagavad Gita, Buddhist stories of the Jataka tales of the previous lives of the Buddha, and say these stories about. So I started bringing Hindu texts and Buddhist texts, maybe something from Mahabharata, Ramayana, things that I knew because there was nobody there to teach me, things I could find in our library. And the boys were thrilled. And it was like this existential bond between me, the Catholic kid from New York, who suddenly was in a classroom in Kathmandu reading the Bhagavad Gita with Hindu and Buddhist students, reading Jataka tales with Hindu and Buddhist students. And we sort of bonded, and that convinced me that somehow this was really possible, to learn and teach, be taught interreligiously. One of the starting points of it, I do want to read you a little text here. When I was early on, when I was just beginning to do this, I was monitoring a study hall. It was a boarding school, so we had to sit with the boys 7:30 to 9 at night while they did their homework and all that. And I ran into a library and grabbed a book off the shelf, and it turned out to be Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali, which I'm sure many of you have read, this beautiful, beautiful text. And I'm sitting there in the study hall and reading this book, or opening it up really, and reading it, and suddenly it kind of explodes in my mind. This I bond with. This is not foreign to me. This is something I can connect with. It took me a while to learn exactly who Rabindranath Tagore was, and he'd won the Nobel Prize for the book and all that. But let me read you the poem that was, for me, the great discovery book. It just happened to be the first poem in the book. I guess that makes sense. This one. Thou hast made me endless, such is thy pleasure. This frail vessel thou emptiest again and again, and fillest it ever with fresh life. This little flute of a reed thou hast carried over hills and dales, and hast breathed through it melodies eternally new. At the immortal touch of thy hands, my little heart loses its limits in joy and gives birth to utterance ineffable. Thy infinite gifts come to me only on these very small hands of mine. Ages passed and still thou pourest, and still there is room to fill. If you know Gitanjali, there are many poems that are very moving. But I think I found there's something of that sense of the touch of God, the infinite kind of possibility into little me, and like playing the flute, which is basically, hollow with holes, and suddenly something happens. And that it suddenly convinced me that I could not only go to Nepal and be the Christian missionary in Nepal and be nice to the boys and give good Christian witness, but that there was something I was bonding with in Gitanjali, later in the Gita, Shivaratri, Diwali, and all this began to connect with me. And by the time I finished my 2 years there, I was beginning to realize that this was something had happened within me that had changed my life. And that many a young Jesuit had gone somewhere abroad, let's say to Latin America or to Africa or the Caroline Islands or sometimes to India or the Far East, and then come back and then got back to an ordinary life and did good Jesuit work, in parishes for many years or teaching in the school. But it struck me that there was this opening into the infinity of Hindu wisdom and Hindu truth and Hindu beauty that I was beginning to experience. And I realized that I didn't want to go back, retreat to the way I'd been growing up Catholic in New York, and didn't need to. That somehow this kind of opening into the other and the back and forth, which I'm sure many of you experienced in your lives, opening up back and forth between the two, was somehow now part of my life, like a very Catholic life, one end of it had been popped open, and there was this other present. People have asked me over the years, why Hindu and not Buddhist? Many young Americans went to Nepal in the 1960s and 70s. Many pilgrims, many people trekking through the Himalayas and so on. And many of them were taken up with Nepali Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, the path of Buddhism, and that's what they followed. I was one of the ones who said, no, the Hindu. And somehow it was the, like Gitanjali, the Bhagavad Gita, the murtis or images of the Hindu deities, the bhajans, the songs that the boys began to sing at the school in my classes and so on like that. All of that I connected with. And my theory was, and we could talk about this when we have Q&A later, is that it was really, my theory was that that Buddhist and Protestant go together better, and that Catholic and Hindu go together better. And I've loved going to Hindu temples over the years, near and far. And I have many Hindu friends who love going to Catholic churches. And there's something kind of, it's on a more elemental level than rational thought, but the bonding and the making of the connections. And so Hinduism got into my life at that point by various things, and I could tell you other stories, or later I could tell you more stories about the connections. And I think it was around that time, maybe by the time I was finishing my 2 years there, I read a book by John Moffat. Some of you may know the John Moffat, Journey to Gorakhpur. So it was a man who grew up Protestant, then for 25 years was a Ramakrishna monk. And he was in India, he was a poet, a writer. He helped Swami Nikhilananda with the translation of the Gospel of Ramakrishna. Wonderful man. And then later in life he left the Ramakrishna order and became a Catholic, of all things. And he wrote this book, Journey to Gorakhpur, which talks about the kind of the flowing back and forth between Christian and Hindu and Catholic. And his book inspired me. I met him only once in his very old age when he was probably pushing 90. But he talked about, people talk about the problem of world religions or the challenge of religions. And he said it's not a problem. It's like an infinite opportunity. And don't be afraid of it. You know, he said to me then when I was young, you're young, don't be afraid of the possibilities. So what I try to do in the book, inspired by people like Moffat, reading the text, my time in Nepal, is try to talk about how this became an irreversible part of my life. I was ordained a priest in 1978, did a year of like parish work, hospital ministry, started learning Sanskrit, did some courses in Sanskrit at Harvard, then did a PhD at University of Chicago in Indian Studies, learned also Tamil, somewhat learned Tamil, a little bit Tamil, and went to South India for a year and a half of research, and began to like go deeper into it as a Catholic and a Jesuit who was learning Hinduism in a deeper way. And what I realized was that, and this is what the book is structured, a formation and a double formation. And the term we use in Catholic seminaries and all that, in the Jesuit order, is the 8 or 10 years when you enter the order and you become a full Jesuit is your formation. You're spiritually formed, intellectually formed, you're formed in how to live in community. It's like a whole way of life that you're learning. And by the time you're ordained, you kind of instinctively have it inside you. However you're dressed, whatever you're doing, it's inside you. I realized that that is beautiful and deep, but that if I was going to study Hinduism, I couldn't do it from a distance, like in an objective, neutral distance, like the academic scholar. Although I am an academic scholar, I couldn't just do it like observing it and looking at it and writing books about what I see, but it had also to get inside me. And I had to have like a second formation, which could never be the same or fully as the first. So I'm Catholic from birth, but somehow to savor the Hindu realities, the poetry, the Vedanta, the other arcane texts that I studied, Purva Mimamsa and so on over the years, getting it, thinking differently, praying differently, meditating differently, seeing Jesus in a certain way, but sometimes seeing images of Krishna or Ramakrishna in my imagination as well, that this was not something to be afraid of. And that if you're serious about learning your own tradition by being intimate to it and letting it get inside you, when you encounter another tradition, to not be afraid of letting it get inside you. And a lot of the book was really about that, about trying to have this double life. So I didn't convert, I didn't become a Hindu, I didn't stay as a Catholic, which said being Catholic means I have to reject that. But somehow the flow back and forth, we can talk about this later, kind of journeying forth as a pilgrim, coming back, going back literally maybe 20 times over the decades, going to India and coming back, but also intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, crossing over and coming back. And that process is really what the book is all about. And I think trying to talk to people about why it is possible not to be simply in one tradition or convert to another tradition, not so much to have a hyphenated identity like I'm both, but rather to be this lifelong pilgrim, where you cross over, come back, cross over, come back, seemed to be what I was trying to find out. And then the last thing I would say, and then I'll come closer to my end, would be writing this book. If you write a book, it should have like a conclusion, or it should have an ending. Not volume 1 of 7 volumes or something like that, but rather say, well, what does this all add up to? And the title of the book is Hindu and Catholic Priest and Scholar, but there's a subtitle, A Love Story. And what I wanted to communicate, particularly, to my colleagues at Harvard, students at Harvard, but also to younger people, is that your life holds together if in some ways it's a love story. So I didn't have any great romances. I talk about some girlfriends over the years and all that, but nothing major, nothing that Hollywood would be interested in. I just like being on the straight and narrow path of being a Jesuit monastic and so on like that. But that the whole thing was a love story. And that there was like a gift given to me when I was young that has somehow permeated my life all the way through. So if you if you go back to 1970, there'd be zero evidence in my life that I'd be standing here now. Zero evidence that I could say for 50 plus years I've been studying Hinduism and I'm still a Catholic. So how did that come about? And I'd like to read you just two little passages, one from the beginning of the book and one at the very end, to talk about how, when I look back at my life, I realize it's been a series of like graces and gifts from God that steer me in this direction, not that direction, that open doors, that make possibilities come about. And it's sort of this love of God infusing my life that has made it possible in a way that I never could have guessed when I was young. So the first passage is one that goes way back to when I was 15. I was 15, I was in high school. It was like between my sophomore and junior year, I believe. A summer night, hot summer night, trying to get to sleep. No air conditioner in those days, just a little fan that was turning and so on. And I talk about this. I'll read it to you just as is. On the night of July 6, 1966, when I was 15, I has what has been turned out to be the defining religious experience of my life, a single instance of God touch. It was a hot night, humid and even stifling. There was no air conditioner, but I think there was a little fan on the desk near my bed. It was quiet. I was alone in what was still my childhood bedroom, and I could not get to sleep. I was a teenage boy, restless in body and mind. Eventually I knew I would fall asleep, but I was not expecting anything unusual to happen. But then I felt a very strong presence, a physical nearness that I knew to be God coming to me. It was God entering into me, piercing me, taking hold of me deep inside. It was an intrusion. It was an awakening. It was something like a sexual awakening. No words, no visions, just being touched, taken over inside, all in a single moment. This original experience of God was a manner of self-love because it was about loving God who was already within me and not outside me. God had entered me before I knew it, yet it was God who was already deep inside me. As St. Augustine put it in his Confessions, God was and became more intimate to me than I was to myself. And now at age 15, I felt this more intensely. I suspect that many of us, and people have talked to me reading this part of the book, that other people have had the same kind of, amazing experience when they're young that they can't forget later in life. A sense of God's presence, of infinity, being loved by God, being one with reality, however one puts it. And for me, it was this like touch, not a vision, not a voice, but being touched. And what I realized that did for me, and this became clearer to me in the writing of the book, is that what it gave me permission to realize was that I was not going to spend my life looking for God, but that God was already there, God was already here, and that my life was going to be a gift in which God showed me the world around me kind of from a Godward perspective, and that I would see life and see the things that happened to me, not looking around to find the answer, to find the right path, to find the right religion, but rather, if you are a person of your tradition who has somehow been touched by God, then that kind of leads you out and says, all the world is my gift to you. And so going to Nepal, becoming a Catholic priest, doing PhD studies, teaching at Boston College, teaching at Harvard, going to India so many times, writing this book, was already like the expansion of an original single moment, a gift. And I think the book wouldn't, my life wouldn't have come about as it is, and I could have been a scholar who writes books from a distance or academically, except that it became very intensely personal, because the personality of God was somehow alive in me. I must say, when I discovered the works of Sri Ramakrishna, I bonded with him. Some sense of reading the Gospel and the Great Master, that I'm not Ramakrishna, of course, in any way, but nonetheless, his experiences, his deep intuition of God, Mother Kali with him, or the God presence within him, and that somehow everything was radiating the presence of God, said, yes, like that. And I think that kind of resonated with me and kept me going over the years. So I'll close by reading the very end of the book. Again, save you time, you don't have to read the whole thing. You can see how it ends. And this is explaining the subtitle. Finally, there is love. The subtitle of this book is a love story, because love is the key to all that I have lived, been given, struggled to keep alive, and honest and vulnerable. Without love, my life could not possibly have taken the course it has. I would not have become a Jesuit and stayed a Jesuit, a companion of Jesus, a priest blessed with the opportunity for regular parish masses, preaching and ministry on campus too. Without love, I could not have made my learning and Hindu tradition so personal to myself. Without love, I would not have had the energy to immerse myself over and over again, and with great effort, in texts, Sanskrit and Tamil and other, that yield wonderful meanings for small audiences and only after hard labor. I would not have persisted in such learning over many decades, evading what for me would have been lesser and easier paths outside my studies and teaching, my preaching, my ever simpler praying. I would not have dug so deeply into scholastic Brahminical thought, nor would I have identified with the self-surrender of a Tamil saint, nor could I even, such that I could not even now read the verses of this saint, one of the Alvars, the Tamil saints of South India, without a thrill, a sense of tears coming to my eyes. Without love, I would not have ever believed that it would be worthwhile to write a book like this, showing you my life and work as just one simple thing. I could not have given it all to you without fear of exposure, or worry that I had said too much or too little. Had I not been loved first, God touching me, looking into me before I ever looked at God, none of this would have taken place. And I end with a quote from a letter of St. John in the New Testament. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment. Whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. We love because God has loved us first. And I'd like to invite you to think that in some way, this sense of love, the sense of the infinite, the sense of the touch of the divine, is what brings us here today and really makes sense of our lives. And we can talk about this later. But thank you for listening to me. Okay. I think I sit down now, or do I make the announcement first? Sit down. Okay.
It's a miracle that these feet do walk, and a miracle that this mouth does talk. It's a miracle, all the words you bring to this voice as my heart does sing. You're the good thoughts running through our heads, the golden sun and our daily bread. You're the mountains and the ocean shore, in all heaven and earth, who could ask for more? You are the eagle in its winged flight, the hoot owl song in the starry night, every baby in its mother's arms, sweetest angels that keep us from harm. What a miracle that we were born, that the sun does rise on every morn, that your love shines through the darkest night and fills us with the gift of sight. You are the tree so green that grows so tall, and the hummingbirds that are oh so small, and the sun so warm, the sun so bright, and the singing whales with all their might. You are the deepest sleep that gives us rest, and the rhythms beating in our breast, and the in and out of every breath, and the courage to do our very best. Of all the miracles before our eyes, that bring sweet joy into our lives, you gave your life, you gave it all.
program just a bit. Thank you so very much for coming, and I think you pointed out beautifully how love bridges all the differences in all the faiths. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, you have questions and answers?
Yes, sure,
Okay, so after he meets you at the door, come back into the temple and you can ask questions and continue the conversation. Okay,
Okay.
next week's lecture is Embracing Change. We had to do it lately.
Thank you for giving me a chance to ask you a question. And that was a beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
I'm Somnath Sarkar. And my question is, imagine if you never went for Hinduism, learning everything you just mentioned today. But after learning Hinduism, how your life had been changed if you wouldn't learn Hinduism?
It's hard in one way to say, of course, because what if? What if I had never gone to Nepal and never studied Gitanjali, Bhagavad Gita, and so on? I think what it has done, because in some ways my life hasn't changed externally at all. So I was a seminarian and I was ordained a Catholic priest. 57 years later, I'm still a Jesuit, I'm still a priest. I still say the Mass in the parish. But the whole kind of dynamic of its inside has been shown me over the years that being committed to your tradition, loving God according to your faith, doesn't mean closed-mindedness or cutting off the other. So I think it's kind of an open Catholicism or an open faith that is not afraid of the other and doesn't kind of hide from it. And I think I could point to many wonderful men, let's say, who are Catholic priests, who don't want to know anything else because their faith is this. I think what Hindu devotion, wisdom has taught me is that it can be open and the learning on the outside. So the ability, to write a book like this, to teach courses like Christ and Krishna, Hindu goddesses and the Virgin Mary and so on, is all different from what I would have done otherwise. But in some ways it's all like in keeping with one life story, if that helps.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You mentioned observing a similarity between Protestants and Buddhism, or a desirability between Protestant practitioners and Buddhist practice, and Catholic practitioners and Hindu practitioners. Could you share a little bit more about that? Because I think some of that also resonated with me.
Okay. I mean, one can always think of exceptions. So here's a Catholic who studies Buddhism, or here's a Protestant who studies Hinduism. I don't mean to be absolute. But my sense was that, at least in many classical forms, Buddhism, let's say Theravada Buddhism of the Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, the Pali Buddhism, the old Buddhism, is very clear of images, clear of rituals, this kind of simple sense of self and reality. And then enlightenment, in a sense, is like it all vanishes, or it's not substantial anymore, like you open up into utter simplicity. And that in some ways, certain forms of Protestantism, like evangelical Protestantism in the tradition of Calvin, or some Lutheran kind of devotion. You go into a Protestant church, even in the Harvard Church on campus, Memorial Church, it's often like empty spaces. And the big thing that you see in the front is the pulpit, a giant pulpit in Harvard's church. You go up, the minister, he, she nowadays goes up there and speaks, and that is the religious moment, the word. I took my students to a mosque, the Islamic Center of Southern California, the other day. Same thing. It's sort of an empty space, no images, just some writing from the Quran in Arabic, and then the imam speaks, and that's the word. Whereas you go into a temple, a Hindu temple, it could be the Venkateshwara temple in Pittsburgh, or the Ganesh temple in Queens, or hundreds of temples out here. I took students to the Hare Krishna temple in Culver City the other day. Lots of images, smells and bells, incense, flowers, all kinds of dancing and imagery and all that, just resonates better for me with the Catholic. And that the positivity is not so much that these are totally contrasting, but that the genius of Hindu tradition is the abundance, the plenitude. It's always kind of overflowing. Even if one is a radical non-dualist, it's overflowing. And everything is part of it. And there's a certain sense, even though the Catholic Church can be very strict and very doctrinaire, the sense of Catholic with a capital C, and then Catholic with a small c means kind of universal. And there's always a sense that everything can somehow relate to the faith. And that kind of thing I'm thinking of. The last thing I'd say is, a few years ago I was at a conference in Rome, and on the last day we were invited to a tour of St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. And the people who enjoyed it most were the Hindus at the conference. They loved being in there with all the statues, with all the images, the bells ringing, the incense from the altar and all that. And it was like intuitively, just as I love going to Hindu temples, they loved being in a Catholic church. It didn't mean they were going to become Catholic, but somehow they felt at home there. That's the kind of thing I was thinking of. Thank you.
You talked about how you use the term like Hindu as a general term for the title of this book, but is there any particular expression or form of Hinduism that appealed to you as a Catholic?
I mean, at first it was kind of hit and miss. So reading Tagore's poetry, reading parts of Bhagavad Gita, some Ramayana passages and so on. Reading, I mentioned John Moffat's book, Journey to Gorakhpur, and then beginning to learn about the Ramakrishna tradition. When I got to graduate school at University of Chicago, seriously studying Sanskrit and then Tamil, it was basically in the darshanas. So, Mimamsa, which is kind of the ritual, understanding of the ritual tradition, understanding of Vedic hermeneutics, the reasoning around the Vedic sacrifices, and then Vedanta. Advaita Vedanta, the Vishishta Advaita Vedanta of Ramanuja, those things I got into because having studied as a Catholic St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and so on, this was a similar kind of rich complexity of thinking about God and the world in these traditions. I eventually studied the Yoga Sutras, and I teach on the yoga tradition also. So that kind of intellectual work. But in Tamil, which is the South Indian language, as you know, the devotional poetry of the Middle Ages, and the 12 alvars, and alvar is often taken to mean like immersed, in God. These 12 saints who wrote ecstatic poetry in the Tamil language, that I've spent a lot of time with, and kind of the beauty of that poetry is kind of drawing you in, not sort of like intellectually scholastic, but the emotionality of it. Something like reading the Song of Songs in the Bible, or Gita Govinda, or some of the bhajans of Sri Ramakrishna, it emotionally pulls you in. So those kind of in two branches, the intellectualism of Vedanta and the Mimamsa and so on, impact of the Tamil. That's probably the ones I've spent most time on. And professionally, writing, you have to, if you're going to be a professor, you have to write about the things you have some expertise in. So I don't write about like Kashmir Shaivism or Vaishnavism in Bengal or Swaminarayan tradition of Gujarat, because I don't have any technical skill. But those kinds of things I was drawn to, and I think they come together in a certain way at a certain point. Yeah.
Did anybody in your chain of command in the Catholic Church have an issue with you studying and delving into Hinduism?
Remarkably, no. So, again, those moments when they could have told me, you can't do it. So when I went to do the teaching, I wanted to go to Nepal. They could have said, no, you're going to go to Manhattan, 83rd Street, 84th Street, teach in the school, or go to Jersey City. They could have said no, they said yes. Likewise, when I was ordained and the superior suggested that you're a smart young guy, why don't you go to Germany and study Catholic theology with some great German theologian, and then you can be a theologian teaching Catholic theology. And I said, but I want to study Hinduism. and can I go to University of Chicago to study Hinduism? And he could have said no, off to Germany, but he said, sure, why not? You can do that. And so I think there was a sense of maybe they trusted me, that I, basically was not going to be crazy or anything like that, and that what I did well. In some sense, the Jesuit order has a great intellectual tradition, and that if I was sort of seemed to be a great intellectual, like, we don't understand what you're doing, but go ahead and do it. And then, when there were theologians being investigated by the Vatican, let's say, in the year 1990, 2000, Cardinal Ratzinger at in the Vatican office under Pope John Paul, theologians would be singled out and their books criticized and so on. Nothing. And either it was a great compliment, like my work is so Catholic, or nobody understands Clooney's books anyway. There's no danger to corrupting anybody's heart or mind. But never did I get a criticism. Once in a while, you read, I run into somebody who's much more conservative than I am, who says you shouldn't be doing that because you're going to lose your faith. I said, well, I've been doing it for over 50 years and I haven't lost it yet. Do you think it's really going to happen like when I'm 80 or something like that? But generally, I've been blessed or lucky, or they didn't care. And so far, I'll probably get a letter in the mail tomorrow, but today, I think up to today, I've been fine.
Thank you. You mentioned about remaining Catholic, but you decided not to convert. That was fascinating to me. Like, what informed you or what prompted you? The conversion was not necessary, but to broaden your spiritual journey.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting point, because I know people who do move from one tradition to another, and I think that can be perfectly understandable in terms of people's life journeys. But remember, when I started, I was a seminarian. Part of my training to be a Catholic priest was to do something like teach. And doing it in Nepal didn't mean I was going to Nepal looking for the meaning of life, but I was going and teaching at St. Xavier's School in Kathmandu. So I wasn't like dissatisfied or looking for something better or more spiritual. But I think I also learned, even from Hindus over the years, that God is where you are. And learning God from your own tradition, your own family, your own blood, your own body, that works, usually. And I've had Hindu friends tell me that they're glad that I didn't become a Hindu. Because they say, if you can't find God where you are, why would you think switching religions will help you? And sort of saying, well, you make sense. You're Irish Catholic, you're an American, you have white skin. It would be really odd to suddenly say, I'm an Indian, I'm a Hindu. And they sort of like the fact of kind of having my feet on the ground. And then my goal has been to try to say, well, that doesn't mean I'm happy in my tradition, therefore I'm not interested in yours, but rather the crossing over. And I have friends who converted. I know people who became disciples of Hindu gurus in the Vedanta Society, or Meher Baba, or disciples of a guru somewhere in India. And God bless them for making their personal journey, but it never seemed to me that God wanted me to do that, or even intellectually that I was being pushed to do that. And that learning from the other is not a replacement for your own, but helps you to see your own deeply in a new way. At least that's what I thought. Thank you.
So it's interesting to me to see somebody go on the spiritual path as a career, because I don't have a career, never wanted one, and my whole spiritual path is not about that. The question that I have is, in Catholicism, enlightenment, because that seems to be a motivation for a lot of people. And so, is that even an option or something that's respected? Because if one is enlightened, they can pretty much fall out of society completely. And some cultures don't look upon that as being something positive for them, for the society. So does Catholicism have a form of that should be even achieved?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think to some extent, the Catholic tradition, and in a sense the larger Christian tradition, are saying, in the world, you find God in the world where you are. And therefore, leaving the world behind, or going off to the forest, or going to the cave, is really not necessary, because God is in all things, God is in all people, God is where you are. However, right from the early years of the Christian faith, there have been the desert fathers and mothers of the early Greek church who'd go out and live very ascetic lives in the desert for the rest of their lives. And they'd leave behind society, the cities, their families, and so on. Through history, we have the Trappist monks, the Cistercian, the Carmelites, the sisters, who withdraw from the world and spend their lives in prayer and meditation for the world, for the sake of the world. But they don't go out of the convent, they don't go out of the monastery, they live in the sacred place. My order, the Jesuits, one of the mottos of our founder, Ignatius Loyola, in the 16th century, was finding God in all things. And that to withdraw from the world was one form of being a Christian, but why not realize that God is everywhere out there in all the people you meet? When you see someone who's in trouble, that is the face of Jesus. When you see somebody in prison, that's the face of Jesus. Go out, go out. I think the last thing I'd say is that I think there are individuals who've been totally enlightened that they can't function in the world anymore. And this maybe is clearer in Hindu tradition or Buddhist traditions. Somebody has this overwhelming experience and they can't function in the ordinary dual world anymore. Usually the greatest Catholic saints are held up as models of people who have an experience of God and then love their neighbor and are out in the world. But I think the Church doesn't condemn that there would be individuals for whom the religious experience is such that they never talk to anyone ever again. They just live solitary lives, alone with God. But it's rarer, I think. It might be more common in Hindu Buddhist traditions, I think.
I found it really interesting that you described this journey for yourself as sort of a pilgrimage between the two faiths that time. And I'm curious if there are any particular elements of your Catholic practice that you find are really easy to kind of, or if at all, they're imbued with sort of a syncretism with Hindu practices too, how in your personal Catholic practices.
I think in some ways, if I can say it positively and not negatively, Christianity, and particularly Roman Catholicism and maybe the Orthodox churches of the East, like the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and so on, have been syncretistic since the beginning. That as soon as the Jesus lived and died, the apostles went out around the Mediterranean, and St. Paul went out around the Mediterranean, and they're already kind of engaging Greek culture, Roman culture, the churches in the East, Armenian culture, Syrian culture, North African culture, the church very old in Ethiopia, and always take on the form, the colors, the music, the language of the local people that you go to, and that then for the images of Jesus and Mary would then be adapted to fit, what does a Roman lady look like? What does a Roman saint look like? Or an Ethiopian or an Armenian? That kind of sacramentality of going out. I think, so some of that is very basic. And I think one form of Christian mission, in the 16th century when Western European missionaries started going everywhere in the world, one view was our job is to erase what is there and replace it with the gospel. So destroying temples, burning books, building church buildings, making it to be Christian. The Catholic tradition, which has also destroyed, temples and done fairly violent things in different places, has often tried to say, as we became the Church of Rome, and the Catholic Church is the Roman Catholic Church, so with a certain sense of Roman culture, Roman language, Latin, the vestments that the priest wears at Mass, the stole and the alb, are basically, and the chasuble are basically what Roman pagan priests wore. Some of the churches in Rome, you can't tell, was this a pagan temple and now it's a Catholic church? A lot of kind of overlap. And then, the greatest of the Jesuit missionaries saying, well, in China, the church should be Chinese. In India, the church should be Tamil or Bengali or Malayali, South Indian. And the sense of the incarnation wasn't, simply that Jesus came as a Jew because he was walking among Jews, but somehow Jesus not would be reincarnate, but when the church goes to a new place, Jesus would look Irish, or German, or Ethiopian, or Peruvian, or Chinese, and Mary too. And the idea of the visitations of Mary to different cultures, always kind of being re-embodied in local places. So I think, despite again what can seem at times to be the hierarchy and doctrinaire nature of the Catholic Church, there's a sensitivity to going local and being local. And I think we're very aware of this now, when the majority of Catholics and indeed of Christians in the world are in what's called the global south, below the equator. So Latin America, Africa, India is technically above the equator, but nonetheless India, or East Asia, the Philippines, some of those cultures very vibrant, Vietnamese Catholic Church, Christian churches, and that the European is no longer identifying, Catholic means Italian, or Catholic means Irish, or Catholic means Polish, but sort of living out the faith other places, saying if Jesus came today, he would be South African, he would be Filipino, Mary would be Chinese, Mary would be from Brazil, and looking at it in different cultures. And the nice thing about Vatican II, the council in the 60s, was to say that now the Mass is no longer in Latin language, but in the local language. And it's not just a matter of taking Latin prayers and putting them officially into any language, but once you put a prayer into Tamil in South India, or Japanese, or Portuguese, the whole culture comes alive, and then the way of hearing and thinking Catholic becomes very pluralistic. Whereas it could be different, like with Jewish people, for the most part, Hebrew is the sacred language, and it's not replaced by English or French or Portuguese, whatever. And for Muslims, even if they're from non-Arab countries, which is most Muslims, Arabic is the sacred language. And the odd thing is that Christianity doesn't really have a sacred language. Like all languages can be the language. And I think that's, it's odd, but it's kind of an advantage that wherever, you'd like to think that wherever there is the church, it becomes rooted like a new plant taking root in the local culture. And I think Hindu does this, and Buddhist does this also. You can think of Buddhism starting in India, then Tibetan Buddhism, Sri Lankan Buddhism, Vietnamese Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, American Buddhism, all kinds of variants. And then Hinduism in Sri Lanka, Hinduism all the way over to Cambodia, Hinduism in Guyana, in the Caribbean, Trinidad. And you see, now here, and Hindu temples all over North America, Hinduism like growing in new soil. And its ability to do that, rather than keeping a distance, it's like becomes part of where you are. So I'd be foolish if I denied that much of what I write and do is American, American, Anglo-American, but it's a way of being Catholic and a way of being interreligious, but that somebody of a different background would have to do it differently because they're not Irish Catholic or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to ask more or less what this lady was asked as well, but on the level of doctrine, I was going to ask if you felt there was anything significant in Catholic doctrine that may have been derived from Hindu teaching.
I think one could say that maybe in the past 500 years, when the Roman Catholic Church has been exposed to India, the Roman Church, I mean, the older churches of the East claim to go back to Thomas the Apostle, and they're in India, 2,000 years ago. But when the Roman Church got there, like 1498, when was it Vasco da Gama landed in what became Goa, since then it would be, certainly in India and South Asia, the church took on ways of worshiping, ways of talking about Christ and Mary and so on that are very South Asian or Indian. In terms of the global church, it would be harder to find examples of how, like, Rome has been influenced by India or by China or by Africa, because Rome is so Roman. I think it would be individual journeys. So I've tried to talk about it in my book. People like Thomas Merton, the monk, who learned a lot from Hinduism as well as Buddhism. He used to teach yoga to the novices at the Trappist monastery. Or Bede Griffiths, who helped found an ashram in deep South India, an Englishman, a monk who was Anglican, then became Catholic, and he spent like 30 years in South India, and his form of Catholicism was very, in a sense, village Hindu. The chapel at the ashram looked like a little Hindu temple. Prayers that would work with the arati. Mass, having the arati, priests taking their shoes off in church, sitting in a lotus position instead of standing behind the altar, and so on. So little ways that it's come in. I think many people debate this about the Catholic Church has for thousands of a very long time been Greek and Roman in its early years, and it's hard to throw that off. So the Greek philosophy, the Roman imperial form. Even the word calling the Pope the Pontiff is a Roman pagan word. And so it was, when Catholicism went global, it was the Roman Catholic Church with its Greek roots, finally grounded in the Bible, that brought Greek, Roman, Jewish Catholicism to India and Asia and so on. It didn't start over again more purely. And people I know, Catholic theologians like in India, say the church has to be a lot less Roman and a lot less Greek and a lot more Indian, a lot more Tamil, a lot more Bengali, if it's going to flourish in Asia. And the same in Japan, the same in other parts of the world. So it has the advantage of having continuity. You can book roots that go back 2,000 years of Catholicism, but sometimes that can get in the way of bringing all this baggage along. And said, I bring you Jesus Christ, and I bring you Greek philosophy, and I bring you Roman ways of doing things, and I bring you Irish ways of doing things. It ends up being a very big baggage, and some people want to simplify it and get rid of a lot of that.
I wonder if you believe that Jesus spent time and was influenced by Hindu teachings in some of those missing years until he was 30 years old, went to India and that kind of thing. Is that something that you believe in, or have some thoughts about?
I think I remain agnostic. It is kind of a strange thing in the Gospels. Jesus is born. Mark's Gospel, the first Gospel, says nothing about the birth of Jesus. Then Matthew and Luke talk about the birth of Jesus. Matthew says nothing. After they flee to Egypt and then back to Nazareth with the baby. Nothing until he's about 30 and comes out of the desert and John baptizes him. Luke only has that one scene when he's 12 years old. They go up for Passover and they think he's with them in the caravan going back home, and he's not, and they have to go back and find him in the temple where he's teaching the priests. And then nothing between 12 and 30. And one view is to say, and it can be unbelievable to people, for most of those first 30 years, he was like a Jewish boy, a Jewish teenager, a Jewish man, a carpenter like his father. Supposedly Joseph was a carpenter, living a life, maybe slightly unusual person, not marrying and so on, but living an ordinary Jewish life until something clicked when he sort of got to 30-ish, which would have been not young in those days. And then suddenly to the baptism, suddenly in the desert, suddenly 3 years of ministry. So 30 years of nothing much, and then 3 years of intense ministry, death and resurrection. So I think it's a natural wonder, wouldn't he have grown wise spiritually by using those years, let's say between 12 and 30, going to India? And it's possible because, we find Roman coins on the southeast shore of, in Tamil Nadu, on the beach. There were these Roman ruins and Roman coins and so on. There were ships back and forth even before the time of Jesus between India and the West, India and the Mediterranean. So it was not impossible. It wouldn't have been a magnificent first thing. But I think the reason I'm agnostic is that much of what Jesus said and taught you can derive from roots in the mystical traditions of the Bible or the Hebrew prophets. He claimed to be, I came to fulfill the law, to be a good Jew in his own way. That all said, people say, well, Jesus was so remarkably different from anyone who went before him. Maybe he learned yoga, maybe he had a teacher in Kashmir, and so on. But just as far as I know, there's no historical or archaeological evidence for or against. And so being a rationalist or whatever, I say, well, since there's no evidence, let us not postulate that he went to India and just that he stayed in Nazareth. Somebody could say, well, if there's no evidence, I'd like to see that he went to the East and learned, drank from Indian wisdom. But some people make it a fact, like it is well known that Jesus went to India. It's not well known. It's not impossible, but it's not like there's no empirical proof of that.
Could you help describe what your understanding or a Catholic understanding of what a Hindu holy man represents from kind of a Catholic theology? Because I think there's kind of a tension between, from some Hindu traditions, perhaps putting Jesus on the same level as somebody like the Buddha or Ramakrishna. But I don't think many Hindus would also say that, they just represent the equivalence of a saint, So there's this tension between viewing Hindu holy men not representing kind of the same figure of Jesus, but also perhaps something beyond what kind of my understanding of Catholic theology would be.
I think, again, there were times in Christian history when the very idea that there be holiness outside Christianity was considered impossible. That, the other religions are from the devil, and they're living in darkness, and there's nothing there, so it's all sin. But I think when there was actual encounters or actual learning, even when, back to the Greeks, Alexander the Great went, to the northwest of India, and his people were amazed by what they called the gymnophysicists, like the naked philosophers, and met these Indian holy men. When Christianity began to be rooted, and we have historical records really only after the Portuguese and so on, they all, the missionaries ran into these holy men and holy ascetics who doing, stupendous acts of asceticism and so on like that, and admiring it, or if they were polemical, saying, they do all this asceticism, but they're still not holy, ha ha ha. That it didn't get them anywhere. So mixed form, because having great ascetical holiness outside of Christianity would, for some of them, have been a threat. Like if they have it, then they don't need us, or they don't need Christ. In more historical times, I'd say, what have Christians or Catholics thought about Sri Ramakrishna, or about Ramana Maharshi, Mahatma Gandhi, and other such figures? Seemingly today, in the modern, let's say in the past 50 years, more willing to say that clearly there is holiness here, clearly God's Spirit is working in these people, and that Catholicism gains nothing by being mean-spirited and denying them entirely. I mentioned Bede Griffiths, the Shantivanam ashram in deep South India. Before him there was Henri Lassault, a French priest, S-A-U-X, and he was deeply influenced by Ramana Maharshi, the non-dualist man who had this radical experience when he was about 15, and then lived at Tiruvannamalai at the sacred mountain for the rest of his life. It changed Lassault's life when he suddenly met a man who was purely non-dual. And others would say, oh no, that's just, that's nothing compared to the faith. But I think many, if not most theologians today would say, yes, we can honor what is holy in these holy people without feeling it has to be a threat to us. You may know who Dorothy Day is. Dorothy Day was the founder of the Catholic Worker, a woman, radically devoted to nonviolence. A lovely book called A Long Loneliness is a story of her life. She died in 1980, but kind of a proponent of peace, nonviolence, work with the poor. There are Catholic worker houses in LA and elsewhere. When Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in 1948, Day, who had become a Roman Catholic and was fairly conservative as a Catholic, she said, never has there been a more Christian person in the 20th century than Mahatma Gandhi. And she was no liberal. She was not, just saying things. But she recognized and said, here is a man who lived his faith from beginning to end. He was nonviolent. He was with the poor. He respected the outcast. He fasted almost unto death. And he died for his faith because he wasn't assassinated by a Muslim or somebody, but it was a Hindu who shot him for being too open-minded. And she said, and she may be a saint of the Catholic Church soon enough, there are cases in Rome, never was there a more Christian person, a more exemplary of Christ in the 20th century than Gandhi, who's a Hindu. And I think that might, for many of us, capture the spirit. When Pope Pope Francis spoke to Congress in Washington, I'm confusing his talks. When he spoke in Washington to Congress, Pope Francis in 2015, he mentioned Thomas Merton, Martin Luther King, and Dorothy Day. But there was another occasion, which is slipping my mind at the moment, where in a recent letter he wrote about like world peace and harmony, he said we need people like Mahatma Gandhi. And that's the Pope of the Church saying, didn't say, oh, if only Gandhi had become a Catholic, then we could have praised him, but we in the 21st century need more Gandhis. And so I think that the spirit of it, other people, when I first got to BC, I taught a course called Holy Men and Women of India. And one very nice old priest on the faculty asked me what I was teaching, and I said the course I was teaching right then was Holy Men and Women of India. And he said, well, what would you teach? There are no holy men and women in India. They don't have saints. They're not saints. And I thanked him very much and then walked away. But it was that old sense that you can't be holy or a saint unless you're in the Christian tradition. That's often, at least among Catholics, pretty outmoded at this point.
Thank you, Father Clooney, for an amazing and inspiring talk. And I'm honored to be your chauffeur and host for today. My question is, after having been immersed in Hindu spiritual thought and experience for so many decades, at such a level of depth and rigor, as a Catholic, have there ever been times when you've felt the need to rethink or to question or to challenge or to even revise aspects of your Catholic beliefs in the light of that Hindu immersion? And just as some examples that are, from my standpoint, I'm a little curious about. For instance, the Hindu doctrine of multiple incarnations, as opposed to the Catholic doctrine of Christ as the sole begotten Son. Another would be the Hindu doctrines of karma and rebirth. And the third, I don't want to generalize and say the Hindu doctrine of universalism, but at least in many Hindu traditions, you do get this idea of universal liberation or universal salvation. It's certainly true of our tradition, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. Have any of those doctrines or other doctrines from the Hindu side lead you to rethink or revise aspects of your Catholic beliefs?
I mean, on the general level, I think you could say that probably over the years, most Catholic doctrines and beliefs I've reimagined in light of Hindu thought. So, because if you know only your own tradition, you can think of it in a certain absolute fashion, but knowing all this other piety, spirituality, intellectual wisdom, philosophy, practice, has always reminded me this is not unique, this is not alone. There are always analogies. So like when I wrote a book years ago on Hindu goddesses and the Virgin Mary, and I'm teaching the course this spring, reimagining Mary not as a Hindu goddess, and not as a goddess indeed, but rather reimagining what Mary is and who Mary is in light of honoring goddesses and realizing that Shri and Parvati and Devi and so on, Kali, are all mirrors or lenses through which to look at Mary differently has changed things for me. So all that goes on. But one of the hardest cases often is rebirth, because it is a fairly standard, it is like the Catholic Christian teaching, one life. Because it goes back to the Bible where, St. Paul says Christ came and died for us once for all. And that one coming of God into the world, one life, one death, one resurrection, one possibility of salvation for all. We have one life like Jesus had one life. And I think there are some Catholics who say, well, Origen, one of the early philosopher theologians of the church, Origen, like in the 2nd century, he seemed to refer to what he called, I think, metempsychosis, which was a form of reincarnation. And therefore, can be a Catholic Christian teaching too. It's a bit slippery because the fact that somebody mentioned it who never became a saint, probably for that reason, meant that it was not really approved of. But he was, before there was like catechisms and doctrines in Rome, he was imagining all the possibilities and imagined everything in nature is reborn. Are we not reborn? I think what I do with that, one Catholic view would be to say, well, the difference between believing in one birth, one life, one death, and multiple lives and births is that our view of one birth is true and their view is false. So, what else is there to say? And another view would be to say, so we believe there's one birth and they believe there are many births. Isn't that interesting? And just leave it at that. I think where I end up in saying is that, as a priest saying the Mass in the parish and all that, I'm not going to start preaching reincarnation at Sunday Mass. Probably wouldn't last very long. Is to say, this is a different teaching. It has deep roots, and you would know better than I, in Indian thought, a different sense of self, what birth is, what death is, the unity of all life, plant life, animal life, human life, divine life, all these things interconnected. And that we can learn from that even if we can't go all the way and say, that's what we believe. So the sense of the interconnectedness of all life, and the sense that it's not just human beings passing through the world, but human beings in relation to animals and plants, let's say, that we're all interconnected, and there's a certain kind of seasons of the human as well as seasons of animal and plant life that we can learn from. And therefore there's not like a unique and absolute difference between us and every other living form. So I've been a vegetarian for more than 50 years now. And a sense of, it started for kind of quirky reasons 50 years ago. But now it would be, who am I to, kill animals and eat them when in some ways we share the same life? Plants have to eat broccoli or something. But thinking around the boundary. So I wouldn't, boldly get up in a Catholic gathering and say reincarnation is false. Or I wouldn't get up and say all Catholics are welcome to believe in reincarnation, but that it poses a question to us that is uncomfortable and that we shouldn't run away from. I mean, the universality of salvation, in some sense, there are Catholic views that salvation is for all, and that Christ wanted all to be saved, and the power of God is spelled out over all reality. The Spirit of God is on all reality. But there's also hell, and that there is a place of eternal damnation. The standard Catholic way now of saying is clear from the Bible there is a hell. It's not clear that there's anyone in it. It might be empty. Space available for renting if you need a party or something like that. But the idea that somehow God, the universality of God's love in Jesus Christ is for all. And some people say, well, if you become a Christian, it's for all. But I think many of us would believe that even Pope John Paul, who's a saint of the church, said something like this, that we should not be stingier than God, because why should we be regretting or annoyed at the fact that salvation is for all when God seems to be generous, Jesus says that the rain falls on all, the sun shines on all. Why would we be stingy and say God cannot be able to save those people? So I'm kind of, going around your question, but it does make me think.
And how about the multiple incarnations?
Wasn't that the rebirth question, or was it a different?
No, I mean like
Of the
God can incarnate not only as
I see.
Ramakrishna.
Oh, okay. Oh, that one. Yeah, okay. I think, the biblical way, which the Catholic Christian way is always indebted to the Hebrew Bible, is that various ways that God kind of infused people's lives. So, Moses called to be a prophet. Some of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, the Spirit of God comes upon them and they speak in God's name, not their own word, but God's word. John the Baptist, the Virgin Mary, kind of filled with the presence of God, comfortable with all of that. And the letter to the Hebrews said, in many ways in times past God has spoken, now has spoken fully in Jesus Christ. The kind of question that comes up in, let's say, the Great Master about, who's a Purnavatara, who's a full avatar, and what about Jesus, what about Buddha, and so on. The Catholic instinct would be to say there are many holy people throughout history, and there's one Jesus Christ. God came on earth once. But I think it's not easy to dismiss and say, Saint Ramakrishna or Saint Buddha or Saint Mirabai or Saint, that they're just saints. They're human beings who tried their best. That there's something greater going on. But there's not really a category in Catholic thought for honoring them as more than human. The immediate case that often comes up is about Muhammad, the prophet. And for many, it's saying, well, Muhammad in Islam is the last of the prophets, the seal of the prophets, the final manifestation of God's word. And then, wait a minute, Jesus was the final word. We can't very well agree that Muhammad is a prophet. Just like Muslims don't know what to say about the Baha'i faith, where the Baha'u'llah, I think, is a prophet after Muhammad. So it's a difficult thing, and there have been groups that have been meeting for years. They're talking about the revelation in the Quran and the revelation in the Bible, and trying to kind of avoid stark yes and no answers, but rather we have to be open to things we can't really explain. I mean, I would say I found someone like Ramakrishna more than simply a saint, but like a divine person. But I can't really, in Catholic terminology, say he's an incarnation, because the term, it's like the grammar of the Christian faith doesn't allow that. But nonetheless, to say he's just a human being who's a really good human being, that doesn't work either. So it's kind of ambivalent. Beating around the bush. I think, are we done? I think.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you. Wonderful. Great questions, and hope to see you. And don't forget to buy my book. The royalties are almost nothing, so I'm not doing it for personal profit, but you might enjoy the book.